At 66, the tragedy of Alan Jackson is beyond heartbreaking. A man who once made America rise to its feet with Chattahoochee and Remember When, who sold more than 75 million records and turned every concert into a sea of voices, now walks a stage where each step feels like a battle. The cowboy hat that once symbolized youthful rebellion has become a shield, hiding scars, both visible and invisible. His story is not just about a country legend, but about a husband, a father, and a man who has stood at the crossroads of betrayal, illness, and unimaginable loss. 3 decades at the very peak of country music, 35 number 1 hits, an unshakable marriage that endured fame's temptations, torn apart by infidelity, stitched together again by forgiveness, a family that survived not only the storms of celebrity life, but also the unthinkable blow of cancer, and later the cruel fate of a daughter losing her husband in a sudden accident. Each chapter of Alan's life reads like a country song filled with love, regret, faith, and pain. Yet even when life seemed determined to break him, Alan Jackson's voice refused to fade. He stood under the lights with trembling legs, telling fans, "If you see me stumble, it's not because I'm drunk. This is the battle I fight every day." That confession stripped away the myth of invincibility and revealed the raw humanity of a legend who could no longer hide. This is not just the story of a superstar. It is the story of a man who sang for millions, stumbled in front of thousands, and still chose to rise time and time again. But the darkest secret was yet to be revealed. Alan Jackson is not simply a musician. He is the embodiment of traditional American country music. With his soft Georgia drawl, tall frame, and humble smile, he became a voice for the working class and a bridge between generations. His songs didn't just climb the charts. They became the soundtrack of Southern life, capturing Sunday church hymns, Friday night dances, and the bittersweet nostalgia of family and love. Born Alan Eugene Jackson on October 17, 1958, in Newnan, Georgia, he grew up in a home so small it had been converted from his grandfather's tool shed. The scent of oil and metal hung in the air, a reminder of his father's life as a mechanic. His mother Ruth worked as a school cafeteria manager, serving food with the same devotion she poured into her children. Their world was modest, but it was a place where resilience was bred and where young Alan first learned the quiet dignity of ordinary people. It was in the pews of a small Baptist church where music first imprinted itself onto his soul. Gospel hymns sung by neighbors and family filled his Sundays with sound and spirit. Yet, it wasn't until he discovered Hank Williams Jr. and John Anderson that he realized songs could tell stories about real people, ordinary men and women wrestling with love loss and longing. For a boy with big dreams and no clear path, this was a revelation. At 16, his parents gave him a guitar, just $50, but it was the key that unlocked his destiny. Within a year, Alan was strumming on stage in a high school production of Oklahoma, a shy Southern boy suddenly transformed under the spotlight. From that moment, the rhythm of life would forever be entwined with strings and melodies. But Alan Jackson's tale is not one of instant glory. Before Nashville, there were countless nights spent hauling amps, setting up lights, and singing for crowds that barely listened. He played for free simply because music had become a hunger that could not be silenced. To his band, Dixie Steele, and the handful of patrons in smoky bars, he was just another dreamer. Yet Alan carried a belief that one day his songs would reach far beyond those dimly lit rooms, and eventually fate intervened, though not in the way one might expect. It was not Alan who met his first savior, but his wife Denise, who happened to cross paths with country legend Glen Campbell on a flight. She told Campbell about her husband, a struggling musician with a fire in his heart. Glen, moved by her words, handed her a business card, a simple gesture, yet one that would forever alter the course of country music. Alan himself would later say, "I'll always feel I owe Glen so much." He was the first person I ever connected with in Nashville. That single connection led him to Arista Records, where he became the very first artist signed to the newly established Arista Nashville in 1989. The journey of a shy boy from Georgia had officially entered the grand stage, but with the spotlight came shadows, shadows that would grow darker with each passing year until tragedy itself seemed to trail him like a ghost. But what trials did Alan Jackson face before fame truly claimed him? On October 17, 1958, in the quiet town of Noonan, Georgia, Alan Eugene Jackson entered the world as the youngest of 5 children. His family's home was not the kind that glistened with grandeur. It was built from his grandfather's old tool shed. The walls carried the clang of his father's tools, the smell of oil and gasoline, and the closeness of a working-class life where space was scarce but love was abundant. His father, Joseph Eugene, worked long days as a mechanic at the Ford assembly plant. His hands were always stained with grease, his back always tired, yet he never complained. His mother, Ruth, worked in the school cafeteria, nourishing not just her children, but hundreds of others, instilling in Alan the quiet strength of service and sacrifice. Growing up in this modest world, Alan absorbed values that would shape his music forever: humility, honesty, and a reverence for simple truths. Music found him in the most ordinary places. At church, gospel hymns rose each Sunday morning, their harmonies filling the air like sunlight piercing through stained glass. These songs weren't about stardom. They were about faith, community, and endurance. They planted in young Alan the belief that music had power to console, to uplift, and to remind people that they were not alone in their struggles. But it wasn't until he discovered the records of Hank Williams Jr. and John Anderson that his heart truly ignited. For the first time, Alan realized that music could speak about real people, about heartbreak and hardship, about Southern life in all its grit and glory. That was when music became not just a sound, but a language he longed to speak fluently. At 16, his parents bought him a guitar for $50. It was a humble instrument, but to Alan, it was a treasure chest. With every chord he learned, a world opened before him. Within a year, he found himself under the stage lights of his high school production of Oklahoma. Shy and unsure in daily life, Alan discovered on that stage a new kind of freedom. The applause may have been modest, but for him, it was a spark proof that music could carry him further than any small town road. Yet dreams in Noonan were fragile. After high school, Alan took on a series of manual jobs, mechanic work, laboring anything that paid the bills. Still, no matter how tired his hands were, the guitar was never far from his reach. At night, he played in a band he formed called Dixie Steel. They weren't stars. They were boys chasing a dream, hauling their own equipment, setting up their own lights, playing in clubs where some nights the crowd barely looked up from their drinks. Often, they earned nothing. But to Alan, those nights were sacred. They were proof that music was not a passing fancy, it was his lifeline. Even then, there was a whisper in his heart that ordinary life was not enough. Every chord was a prayer to escape the limits of Noonan, to chase something greater. And in 1985, after years of scraping by, Alan and his wife Denise made the boldest choice of their lives to leave Georgia behind and move to Nashville, the promised land of country music. But Nashville was no paradise. Their first apartment was small with few comforts. Alan took a job in the mailroom at the Nashville network just to keep food on the table, while Denise continued working as a flight attendant. They lived day-to-day survival, their only certainty. Dreams don't pay the rent, and every bill was a reminder of how unforgiving the path to stardom could be. Yet fate was quietly preparing its hand. One ordinary flight, Denise crossed paths with country legend Glenn Campbell. Boldly, she spoke about her husband, how Alan lived and breathed music, how he carried a hunger too fierce to ignore. Campbell listened, then handed her a business card with the words that would forever change their lives. "Tell him to call." That card was more than paper. It was a door, and soon Alan Jackson would step through it. But what awaited him in Nashville was not just opportunity, it was a crucible of failure, perseverance, and the long climb toward a dream that seemed forever out of reach. Nashville in the mid-1980s was a city paved with broken dreams. Every street corner had a singer with a guitar. Every bar had a hopeful voice fighting to be heard. For Alan Jackson, stepping into this world was like diving into a storm. He and Denise lived in a cramped apartment where every dollar was stretched thin. Alan worked at the Nashville Network's mailroom, sorting envelopes and carrying packages, all while clutching the hope that one day his own name would be on those letters. But the city was merciless. Clubs were crowded with talent, and labels seemed deaf to tradition, preferring the glossy sound of pop country. Alan was different. He didn't want to bend. He wanted to make real country music songs, born from dirt roads, heartbreak, and the voices of ordinary people. That stubbornness would cost him opportunities, but it would also become his most defining strength. The turning point came because of Denise. On that fateful flight when she met Glenn Campbell, destiny cracked open just a little. Campbell, touched by her sincerity, gave her his manager's card. Alan followed up, and doors began to creak open. Slowly he found himself in the circles of Nashville's insiders. His sack full of songs, lyrics, scribbled on napkins, notebooks, and scraps of paper, suddenly mattered. He met producer Keith Stegall, who would later laugh about the paper sack full of songs that Alan carried like it was treasure. By 1989, lightning finally struck. Arista Nashville had just launched, and Alan Jackson became its very first signed artist. To a man who once hauled his own speakers in smoky bars, it felt like the sky itself had opened. A year later, in 1990, his debut album, Here in the Real World, was released. The record wasn't just a success, it was a declaration. Songs like the title track and Wanted captured raw honesty, reminding fans of the country music they feared was slipping away. That same year, Alan's life came full circle in a way that felt almost destined. On live television, he was awarded his first gold record, and Glenn Campbell, the very man who had unknowingly opened the first door, stood by his side. For Alan, it was more than recognition. It was proof that sometimes the smallest encounters can rewrite entire futures. Through the 1990s, his career exploded. With hits like Chattahoochee, Living on Love, and Gone Country, he wasn't just climbing charts, he was shaping the very soul of country music. And yet, his songs often came from humble beginnings. Don't Rock the Jukebox, for instance, was born one night when an actual jukebox rattled and broke during a tour stop in Virginia. Alan leaned against it, and the idea for a hit poured into his mind as if the music gods had whispered it directly to him. But fame wasn't simply about hit records. Nashville itself was at war. Pop influences were creeping into the genre, pulling artists toward commercial trends. Many bent under the pressure, but Alan refused. His heart was tied to tradition. That defiance culminated in his collaboration with George Strait on Murder on Music Row in 2000. The song accused the industry of killing country music for profit, cutting out its heart and soul. It was controversial, even incendiary. Some called it a rallying cry. Others thought it was too bitter. But for Alan, it was the truth. By the time the decade closed, Alan Jackson was no longer just another hopeful voice in Nashville. He was a force, a man who arrived with nothing but a guitar, a sack of songs, and a stubborn love for real country had now become one of its fiercest defenders. Yet success was only one side of the story. Fame has its price, and for Alan, the spotlight would soon expose fractures in his personal life, cracks that no award or chart position could ever mend. But what happens when the brightest lights of fame cast the darkest shadows at home? By the early 1990s, Alan Jackson had become a household name. With his tall frame mustache and ever-present cowboy hat, he looked like he had stepped straight out of a country ballad. But it wasn't just the look, it was the music. Songs like Chattahoochee, She's Got the Rhythm, and I Got the Blues, and Someday filled radios across America, resonating with both old-timers who longed for the sounds of Hank Williams and a younger generation just discovering the magic of country storytelling. Chattahoochee, in particular, turned into more than a song. It became an anthem. With its playful lyrics about growing up along the riverbanks, the track connected across class and culture. It was a reminder that country life, though simple, carried universal truths: friendship, love, adventure, and bittersweet memories of youth. The song shot to the top of the charts and won both the CMA Single and Song of the Year in 1993. His album A Lot About Livin' and A Little About Love went triple platinum, confirming that Alan Jackson wasn't just another artist, he was shaping the golden era of 1990s country music. By the mid-decade, his name was inseparable from the genre itself. Yet Alan never forgot where he came from. Unlike many artists who adopted the glitz of Nashville's changing scene, he stayed true to the roots. His lyrics were often autobiographical songs about his father, Drive for Daddy Jean, his marriage, Remember When, or even the chaos of American life, Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning. These weren't just hits, they were lived experiences transformed into melody. One of the most iconic stories of this period came after September 11th, 2001. Alan, like millions of Americans, was shaken. One early morning, he woke with lines in his head. Where were you when the world stopped turning that September day? By the time his wife and children left for Sunday school, he had written the entire song. When he performed it at the 2001 CMA Awards, the arena fell silent. For 5 minutes, the world paused to hear a simple man in a cowboy hat sing words that captured grief, faith, and resilience. The song went on to win his first Grammy and became preserved in the U.S. Congressional Record as a testament to history. Fans didn't just hear the song, they lived inside it. But the peak of fame wasn't only about national tragedies or global recognition. It was also about small, unforgettable details that made Alan more than a voice. In a GQ photo shoot, he revealed his passion for custom boots, dozens of pairs, including a flashy red set he once wore while water skiing in the Chattahoochee music video. His cowboy hat, once a cover for a childhood scar, became a permanent symbol of his identity. He even bent the brims himself to fit his face, insisting that cowboy hats weren't fashion. They were a culture, a way of being. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, his albums Who I Am, 1994, High Mileage, 1998, Drive, 2002, Good Time, 2008, sold millions. He became one of the best-selling artists of all time, eventually reaching over 75 million records worldwide. He earned his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, and received the ACM Poets Award for lyrics that cut straight to the bone of human experience. Fellow artists recognized his impact. George Strait, his idol-turned-collaborator, performed Murder on Music Row with him, a song that declared war on Nashville's pop invasion. Eric Church, Luke Bryan, and countless younger stars credited Alan with shaping their love for country. At award shows, tributes poured in hailing him not only as an entertainer, but as a guardian of tradition. Fans, too, felt that authenticity. At concerts, when Alan sang Remember When, entire arenas fell into hushed silence before erupting into tears. The song spoke of marriage loss and the fragile beauty of time universals that cut across generations. One elderly fan once said, Alan's music is like a diary of Southern life, and each of us has a page in it. This was Alan at the very summit. He had it all: awards, fame, fortune, and a family by his side. To the world, it looked like a fairy tale, a boy from a tool shed in Georgia who rose to become a national treasure. but behind the glitter of trophies and the roar of applause, cracks were beginning to show. Long tours kept him away from home. Temptations lurked in the shadows of fame. His marriage, once a fortress, would soon tremble. And just as Alan Jackson reached the height of his career, the darkness of tragedy crept closer, testing not only his music but his soul. But what happens when a man who sings of truth and love finds himself caught in betrayal, illness, and heartbreak? Fame, for all its glitter, cast shadows long and cold. By the late 1990s, Alan Jackson's life looked like a dream from the outside: awards, sold-out tours, and a loyal family waiting at home. But inside that home, cracks had begun to form. Endless nights away on tour, weeks of separation, and the intoxication of fame pulled Alan further from Denise, the woman who had stood with him since their teenage years. In 1998, the foundation nearly collapsed. Alan admitted to being unfaithful. For Denise, who had given up her career to support his dream, the betrayal struck like a lightning bolt in the heart. She later wrote in her memoir, "I felt like my whole world fell apart. Lonely, hurt, and shattered, she sank into depression, questioning not only her marriage, but her sense of self. I gave up the work I loved to follow his dream, and in the end, I lost myself," she confessed. Alan, too, felt the weight of his choices. The applause of millions could not quiet the silence in his home. Regret gnawed at him, and for the first time he confronted the truth that fame had given him everything except the peace of knowing he hadn't broken the one person who loved him unconditionally. Their separation was painful, yet Denise chose to turn not to revenge, but to faith. She discovered that love was more than romance. It was forgiveness, grace, and the courage to rebuild. Slowly, step by step, Alan fought to regain her trust, and together they pieced their marriage back together, proving that sometimes love survives its own collapse. But tragedy was not finished with the Jackson family. In 2010, another storm arrived. Denise was diagnosed with cervical cancer. The word itself felt like a death sentence. Chemotherapy ravaged her body, stripping her strength, dimming her once bright presence. Alan, the man who had stood strong before thousands, became a helpless husband, sitting by her hospital bed, holding her hand through endless nights of fear. He poured his anguish into music writing, "When I saw you," leaving a prayer in the form of melody. Denise later said, "When you know you're loved and needed, you find the strength to overcome anything." Against all odds, she survived. Her recovery was not just a medical victory, but a triumph of love and resilience. As if fate enjoyed cruelty, more heartbreak came in 2018. Their eldest daughter, Maddie, lost her husband, Ben Seligman, in a tragic accident. At only 28, he fell while helping a friend onto a boat, suffering fatal head injuries. In an instant, joy turned into mourning. Alan described Ben as a devoted man who loved his family and embodied everything we ever hoped for Maddie. The loss was unbearable, a wound that words could not mend. Yet, out of the ashes of grief, Maddie founded a charity to support women and children in need, carrying forward Ben's spirit of kindness. For Alan and Denise, her courage became proof that pain could be turned into purpose. But perhaps the cruelest blow came in 2021, when Alan himself revealed he had been diagnosed with Charcot-Marie tooth disease, a rare inherited neurological disorder. It was a thief stealing his balance, weakening his muscles, making his once commanding stage presence falter. Fans sometimes thought he was drunk when he stumbled. Alan clarified with heartbreaking honesty, "If you see me stumbling on stage, it's not because I'm tired or drunk. This is the battle I fight every day. The disease has no cure. Treatments only ease symptoms, never restore what's been lost." Yet Alan refused to retreat. He continued performing, declaring, "I'm going to sing as long as I can sing. That's all I've ever wanted to do." Each concert became an act of defiance, each note a victory against a body that betrayed him. Denise, who had once fought her own battle with cancer, now became his rock. She stood beside him through his weakest moments, whispering strength when his legs gave way. Together they had faced betrayal, disease, and death, and still they endured. For fans watching Alan stumble, yet sing with unbroken voice, became a haunting image, a man whose body weakened, but whose soul remained unshaken. His tragedies were no longer private, they played out in the public eye. But in his vulnerability, he became even more beloved. He wasn't just a star, he was human. And yet, as illness reshaped his future, Alan Jackson still found a way to turn personal suffering into something greater. But how does a man haunted by tragedy transform pain into legacy? After decades of storms, Alan Jackson entered his later years, not as a man defeated, but as one tempered by fire. Illness slowed his steps, but it did not silence his voice. In 2024, he announced what would be his final great journey, a farewell tour titled Last Call, One More for the Road. Beginning in Boston and stretching across 10 major cities, it was more than a tour, it was a living testament to resilience. Each ticket carried with it a pledge. $1 from every sale would go to the Charcot-Marie Tooth Research Foundation, transforming his private battle into hope for millions facing the same disease. At each show, the emotion was palpable. Fans wept openly as Alan sang, "Remember," when their tears mingling with his trembling yet unwavering voice. Critics noted how his unsteady legs contrasted with the strength of his singing, creating a raw honesty no stage trick could replicate. What some once mistook for weakness became a symbol of bravery. Alan wasn't hiding his illness, he was singing through it. Off stage, life took on a quieter rhythm. On his farm in Franklin, Tennessee, Alan found solace in the simple joys he had always cherished. He restored vintage cars, a passion that tied him back to his youth when he first bought a 1955 Ford Thunderbird. He fished by quiet rivers, tended to gardens, and reveled in the laughter of his grandchildren. "I've got one grandbaby and another on the way. It makes me want to be home more," he confessed. In those words, one hears not the voice of a star, but of a grandfather finding peace in the small, enduring treasures of family. Though his last studio album, Where Have You Gone, was released in 2021, Alan never stopped writing. Lyrics continued to spill from him, proof that creativity remains untamed even as the body falters. His website and YouTube channel kept fans close, ensuring his presence remained alive even as touring became harder. In 2024, the Academy of Country Music honored him with the Poets Award, a recognition reserved for artists whose words carved themselves into the fabric of generations. Yet Alan still had one final surprise. After the last scheduled stop of his farewell tour in Milwaukee, he revealed there would be a special show in Nashville in 2026, a final gathering in the city that had given him both heartbreak and triumph. "Some of the best moments come at the very last minute," he said. For fans, it felt like a promise, one last chance to sing together, one last memory to hold. Today, Alan Jackson stands as a man who has lived through betrayal, illness, grief, and fame's cruel toll, yet emerged with his soul intact. His legs may falter, but his spirit burns steady. His voice, though tested by time, still carries the warmth of southern nights, the honesty of plain-spoken truths, and the resilience of a heart that refuses to quit. But what will remain after the last curtain falls, when the lights dim and Alan Jackson no longer takes the stage? Alan Jackson's legacy is not carved in stone or gilded in trophies. It lives in the voices of millions who have sung his songs as if they were their own diaries. More than 75 million records sold a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and his induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame mark his achievements, but numbers alone cannot measure his impact. What truly defines Alan's place in history is how his music became a mirror for ordinary lives. When Luke Bryan, one of today's biggest stars, was asked about his earliest influences, he said he grew up with Allen's music, playing alongside George Strait and Merle Haggard. Allen was more than an idol. He was a blueprint for what it meant to be a Southern man, Bryan admitted. Eric Church, too, called him a national treasure, a poet whose words distilled the honesty of rural America into timeless lines. Perhaps Allen's greatest cultural contribution was his refusal to compromise. At a time when Nashville bent increasingly toward pop gloss, he stood firm for tradition. Murder on Music Row, his searing duet with George Strait, wasn't just a song, it was a manifesto. It accused the industry of killing country music's heart for commercial gain. Some called it controversial. Others said it was too blunt, but history has remembered it as a battle cry, cementing Allen as one of the genre's defenders. His songs carried more than nostalgia, they carried values. Remember When became a meditation on love and aging, while Drive for Daddy Jean bridged generations, tying Allen's childhood memories of his father to the simple joys he shared with his daughters. Fans wept not because the songs were sad, but because they were real. One elderly fan put it perfectly: Allen's music is like a diary of Southern life, and each of us has a page in it. Beyond music, Allen's cultural presence extended into style. The cowboy hat, the mustache, the faded jeans, the custom boots, they weren't costumes, they were extensions of a man deeply bound to his roots. In an era when country stars often reshaped themselves for glamour, Allen remained unvarnished. That authenticity became his armor, allowing fans to trust him, not only as an artist, but as a man. His resilience in illness further deepened his cultural weight. When Allen revealed his Charcot-Marie-Tooth diagnosis, fans didn't pity him, they admired him. To see him stumble yet continue singing was to witness courage embodied. In his vulnerability, Allen became even more iconic. He showed that legends are not made by perfection, but by persistence. Allen's legacy also pulses through philanthropy. His decision to donate from his farewell tour ticket sales to fund research for the very disease he battles turned his private struggle into collective hope. That act transformed concerts into more than entertainment. They became communal efforts to fight back against despair. What lingers most is the simplicity. Allen never pretended to be larger than life. He was the son of a mechanic and a cafeteria worker, a boy from a tool shed who climbed onto the biggest stages yet still sang about fishing trips, first loves, and family suppers. In his music, people found themselves ordinary lives lifted into poetry. And in that, Allen Jackson secured something no award can quantify. He became part of America's cultural memory. His voice will echo long after he leaves the stage, not only in records, but in the everyday moments when someone hums Chattahoochee by a river or whispers the words of "Remember When" during an anniversary dance. But when looking at both the triumphs and the tragedies, how should we truly judge Allen Jackson, the man, the artist, the husband, and the flawed human being behind the legend? Allen Jackson's story is not a fairy tale. It is a tapestry woven with triumph and tears, faith and failure. To speak of him only as a country legend would be too simple. To speak of him only through the lens of his tragedies would be unfair. The truth of Allen Jackson lies in the balance between the two. On one hand, he is one of the last guardians of traditional country music. At a time when Nashville glittered with pop sheen, Allen stood stubborn, keeping alive the sound of steel guitars and honest storytelling. Without him, perhaps country music would have lost its soul far sooner. For that alone, he deserves to be remembered as a cultural warrior, a man who believed that music should never betray its roots. But Allen was not flawless. His marriage bore the scars of betrayal, and his choices hurt the very person who had built his dreams with him. Denise's forgiveness became part of his redemption arc, but it also reminds us that legends are not immune to human weakness. In a way, this imperfection makes his story more relatable.
That's the way it
Alan did not simply sing about mistakes and redemption,
goes.
he lived them. His tragedies, his wife's cancer, his daughter's loss, his own incurable illness are almost too much for one life to hold.
Having a good time,
and yet,
whatever.
Alan never chose silence. He transformed pain into melody, standing on stage when his legs would barely hold him, declaring, "I'm going to sing as long as I can sing." That courage makes his voice echo even louder. So how should we see Alan Jackson as a superstar who sold 75 million records, won Grammys, and filled arenas? Yes, as a man who stumbled, betrayed, and wept. Also, yes, his legacy is not built on perfection, but on persistence, on the way he carried his mistakes, his heartbreak, and his illness with the same honesty that marked his music. Alan Jackson's journey is ultimately about resilience. He reminds us that greatness is not the absence of flaws, but the strength to keep singing through them. And perhaps that is why fans continue to weep at his songs. They see their own struggles reflected in his. But as the curtain slowly falls on Alan's career, what remains is not just music, but a haunting nostalgia, a story that lingers even after the final note fades. The story of Alan Jackson is not merely about music, it is about time itself. A boy from Noonan, Georgia, once strummed a $50 guitar in a high school auditorium, never knowing that his songs would one day echo across continents. Decades later, that same boy, now an older man with faltering steps, still carries the same guitar and the same fire. The world has changed around him, but Alan has always remained who he was at the beginning, simple, honest, unshaken in his love for music. There is a haunting beauty in seeing him now. The legs may tremble, the body may betray him, but the voice warm, plain-spoken, true still cuts through the silence. When he sings, remember when audiences do more than listen. They relive their first kisses, their wedding vows, the laughter of children, the bittersweet memories of parents long gone. In those moments, Alan is no longer just a man on stage. He is memory itself, a vessel carrying the past into the present. On his farm in Franklin, surrounded by his grandchildren, Alan seems far from the roaring arenas, yet the same values linger: the laughter around a kitchen table, the sound of boots on wooden floors, the hush of evening prayers. Fame fades, but these small moments remain eternal. Perhaps this is the greatest truth his life offers, that the legacy of a man is not found in the spotlight, but in the quiet ways he is remembered by those who loved him. Alan Jackson's journey is a reminder that even legends stumble, even heroes break, and even the strongest voices grow weary. But what makes him unforgettable is not that he escaped tragedy, it is that he walked through it guitar in hand and kept singing. Some stories are written to inspire, others are written to haunt. Alan Jackson's is both, because long after the final concert ends, long after the last note fades into silence, his voice will linger like a whisper in the heart-fragile, flawed, yet impossibly enduring. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now you know.
I like seeing the fans.